Producing the manuscript. A start point was my father's written autobiography, which the care home activities coordinator in Canada had supported him to write. This was just sent around to family members, but it provided lots of context and insight into his upbringing, which I learned had been very hard. Apart from his autobiography, my main reaction was cynicism. I simply couldn't believe what he was telling me. Because I really didn't know him very well after a 50-year silence, I checked and rechecked his assertions with the purpose of disproving him. He sent me garbled emails with approximations of dates, times, places, and events, some of which didn't make sense. I sometimes wrote back quite harshly, asking him to be more specific, to stop using RAF nicknames and jargon, to take time to remember people's proper names and the correct sequence of events. One of the key figures in the book, Mitya, was one of the clearest in my father's memory, but I've never been able to corroborate his actual identity. He could be Vasily Mishin, the successor to Korolev on the Soviet space program, or not. He remains an enigma. It was a long time before I told my father I wanted to write it all up into a manuscript. I wanted to include the personal story of how he left our family and the story of how he met my mother through the Marriage Bureau in Bond Street, London, the first of its kind ever to be set up. I told my mother about the book, and she told me about meeting my father through this bureau when she was aged 26 and he was 36. She showed me Marriages Are Made in Bond Street, a book written by Penrose Halson, the person who had run the successor bureau to the one my parents met through. I contacted Penrose for any surviving details of my parents' meeting, any forms or notes, and she was so helpful that she ended up being one of my critical readers. It was so great to have a respected published author on board supporting my efforts. Once my father knew there was to be a book, he tried to give more detail and to remember key people more fully, such as Wing Commander Eric Ackerman, who was his superior officer in the RAF. Every section of the book I completed, I sent over to him to read and check. His comments were almost always exactly the same, that I had it right, but that I had made it so much more exciting than it really was. He told me that throughout his time working with signals intelligence, nearly a decade, he had mostly been either bored silly or scared stiff. He didn't change a word, but he marvelled at the emerging story, with himself as some kind of anti-hero, never quite in control of anything, and rarely doing anything he actually wanted to do. The romance with the Finnish cello player he quite rudely called exaggerated, until I asked him to tell me how it really was, how it felt to him. There was such a long silence, I thought he would never speak to me again. But then he said yes, he had been completely in love, and that his love would always be mixed with the most sincere gratitude. That gave me the go-ahead to include the material about him and Karina. I made contact with Eric Ackerman's son, Nick, who lives in the USA, for more information about his father. Nick was and remains interested in the whole project. I found that there was even a book about Eric Ackerman called Covert Radar and Signals Interception, The Secret Career of Eric Ackerman. This provided more insight and context. Eric Ackerman was my father's boss in the RAF. And then another book, Most Secret War by R.V. Jones, who was Eric Ackerman's mentor and boss, and one of Winston Churchill's scientific officers. By now, all of this material had really grabbed my interest. It was no longer dry, distant history to be avoided at all costs. It was a living, breathing narrative. It had exciting parts, hair-raising even, such as my father's escape from the island in Russia and his pursuit by the KGB. Long periods of no activity on the book would be followed by feverish progress. Our goal was getting it all written down. My father's wife died. He had a cataract operation. He exercised the prerogative of the very old and slept through a scheduled Zoom call. I had work projects, other things to attend to. I didn't want to write all the time. Throughout the writing process, I never felt warmth coming through from him, or that he was relaxing into the relationship with me. We simply worked on a project together. Writing the book has been cathartic. I now understand my father far more, and I certainly don't hate him. But even with this huge writing project in common, you can't make up for a lifetime of silence, and I think he knew not to try. See my next video to find out how the Gorodomlya Island project was published.